In this video, we're going to look at some example Python functions, things that are part of the standard library that we've used during the semester. And remember, as we look at each function, we're going to think about what information did we have to pass into the function? Those are the arguments. And what information did we pass out of the function? What was the return value from the function back to us? And we're also going to take note of the format or syntax of each of the function calls that we used over the semester so that we can get a sense for how those work in Python. So one of the first methods or functions that we learned how to use is the print function. And the goal of that's just to display some information to standard input. That was one of the first things that we learned how to do. The syntax for calling the print function is the word print, and then parentheses, and then information that represents the combination of string literals and variable identifiers, the information that we want to print out to the screen. And in Python, the print function requires one argument. It's the combination of literals and variable identifiers that we want to display. And the print function doesn't have a return value. There's nothing that comes back that we need to capture. Instead, it just does something. It displays the information that we specify out to the screen. So some examples of calling the print function are things like typing in print and then hello. Whoops, gotta spell it right. Print hello. And of course, that prints that information back to the screen. So it's carrying out an algorithm that tells it to print out these letters to standard output. If we have a variable in our program that's defined to have a particular name value, we could also say print and then the name, and that will, of course, print the contents of that variable. And we can combine those together. We can have a literal value and also a variable and print the combination of those two things to the screen. So the print method, again, is an algorithm that somebody else has written, and then we're able to leverage that in our program. We don't have to know, like, what do we need to do low level in Python to make it display a combination of characters to the screen. Somebody else has already written that algorithm for us, and so this tool allows us to perform that action in our program. And we don't have to understand all the details of how that happens. So it's nice for us, the programmer. Here's another method that's really, or another function that's really familiar to us. It's the input function. And the goal for that one is to receive data from standard input. We also learned this really early on in the semester. And the syntax for calling this, you have to say something like value entered equals, and then include your function call, the name of the function, input, and then in parentheses, you give it the argument or information that you want to apply this algorithm to. So we give it the prompt that we want to display to the user. This particular method, or I keep calling them methods because some programming languages call them methods, but Python, we're going to call them functions. But if I ever slip up, those two things mean the same thing. So this function requires one argument. It's the string that should get displayed to the user as the prompt. And the return value from the input function is the data that the user entered through standard input. And again, we don't have to understand the magic of what happens behind the scenes in this particular function. We just need to be able to know kind of high level, what does this do in order to use the tool in our program. So an example of a function call using the input function is name equals input, please enter your name. And we know we can enter that in Python, and it'll allow us to provide user input. It'll ask us for our name. We can type in anything we want. And then it'll store that value as the name. If I go back and print name, it'll store Karen now because that's the information I provided at user input. So it's another example function. Another one that we've used is the int function. Its goal is to change a string into an integer data type. So we've used that sometimes as part of the input command. We can also use that just on its own. So if we had a particular identifier that we stored as a string value and we wanted to treat it as an integer, we could do that by putting the int method in front of that value. So it requires one argument, the string that you want to convert, and then the return value that comes back is the integer equivalent of that string value. So for example, if I said something like digit equals input, please enter a number, it'll ask me to enter a number, but because I didn't put the int in front of this input, it's going to store the number that I enter as a string. So if I say, what's the type of digit, it'll tell me it's a string. But if I want to treat that as though it's an integer, I can say int equivalent equals int digit. If I print out int equivalent, it's still going to look the same. The data is still going to store the 8. But if I ask it to tell me the data type of int equivalent, it's going to tell me it's an integer. So that particular method, again, what it's used for is to take something that's a string and change it so that it has a integer equivalent of that particular value. Some other examples that we've used so far this semester, we used the length method. We could use that to find out how many characters make up a string. And the format for that, we put the function name, len, and then the argument represents the string that we want to find the length of. And then the return value is the number of characters in that string. So we might call it something like, I might want to know what's the name of the length of my name that I entered. So if I print that out, it tells me 5 because there's 5 characters in Karen, which is the current value of name in my Python window. We also can use the length method or function on a list of values. So if I stored a list in my program, what should I call it? Let's do the ice cream list again. We've done that a bunch of times. If that stores chocolate and lime, you guys were into lime ice cream, I remember that. And then we say, tell me what's the length of the ice cream. I could say, give me the length of the ice cream list. And if I print that out, it should tell me 2. Because we have 2 values in that particular list. So the length method works similarly on strings and on just generic values that are part of a list. So it requires one argument, the list that we want to find the length of, and then it returns the number of items in the list. Today in the lecture, I've also been using this type function, which you might remember we used kind of early on in the semester when we were learning about different data types. And the goal of that function is just to find the data type of a particular variable. You type in the name of the function, type, and then the argument, the information you provide, is the identifier of the variable whose type you want to find. And then the result is a data type. So you could have variables in your program like a floating point value or a string, and then if you ask it what the data type is, it'll print that out. So the data type of str is, and it'll be a string because it's storing a collection of letters. And the data type of number, if we type that into Python, it would print double because that's a decimal, or sorry, float, because that's going to store a decimal value. And these are just kind of the tip of the iceberg. There's lots of other functions in Python. So these are just a few common ones that we've used frequently over the semester. In general, if you look back over the syntax for most of these, you see that they're like really similar when we call these various method or functions. A lot of them have something equals and then the name of the method with the arguments in parentheses. A few of them didn't have the equal sign in front of them, and you might wonder what's up with that. So in general, anytime that you're calling a function and it doesn't return a value, the function call syntax looks like this, where you put the name of the function, that's like print or whatever the name of the function is. Then you always have parentheses. That's like a dead giveaway that you're calling a function. Anytime this semester where we used parentheses right after a command, we were calling a function. And inside the parentheses, you include your arguments, the information that the function requires in order to operate properly. So an example of a function that we've called that doesn't return a value is the print function, where we type in print, and then the information it needs to operate on, that's our string or variable or combination of the two. And it doesn't return a value, so we don't have to set it equal to anything. On the other hand, if we're calling a function and it does have a return value, it's going to make some sort of calculation, perform some kind of activity, and want to communicate information back to us, then the function call looks like this, where we say result equals, and then the name of your function, and then parentheses with your arguments. So the right-hand side looks exactly the same. The only difference is because this one does return a value, we have to save that somewhere. A lot of times I'll call it result, but you can also call it anything you want. Any kind of valid identifier can go over here on the left side. So for example, if we wanted to store the number of items in a list of ice cream flavors, and our ice cream flavor list was called flavor list, we could say num items equals len flavor list. That's calling the flavor or the length method using this information, our list, and then it's going to return information back to us. We have to catch that somewhere. So we have to set a particular variable equal to that return value.